All right, it's 2 o'clock, so let's get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Myra Snell, and I'm the Executive Director of the California Acceleration Project and a professor of mathematics at Los Medanos College. Today, we are with Kelly Spoon to talk about getting started with a new approach to grading. This webinar will be recorded, and you can find the recording on the California Acceleration Project's website, which is accelerationproject.org under events. And you will also find the recordings to all of the alternative grading webinars we have done this fall. What else do I need to say? Q&A. We'll have the chat open, and Kelly has put an invitation there for you to introduce yourselves if you want to. And we have the Q&A also open, which just helps us keep track of questions. So if you have a specific question, we will definitely see it if you put it in the Q&A. All right, Kelly, anything else we need to do with bookkeeping?
I don't think so.
All right, great. Let's get started.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Spoon. I teach at San Diego Mesa College, where I've been lucky enough for the last 3 semesters to only teach supported STEM calculus. I have a couple of other positions on campus, so I'm able to have just one class, which has been amazing because I've been able to focus on really iteratively thinking about what this course might look like. And I'm really excited today to have a chance to talk about grading. I've done a number of workshops and presentations on grading, but they've always been sort of across disciplines, usually I'm facilitating those with the English faculty. So it's really fun to dive into the same work, but focusing on not only math, but a particular course. So I did invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat. Thank you very much, Mark, for starting us off. But in the chat, I also thought we'd just start off with, hopefully you're here because you see something that could be improved with grading. So I was hoping that we might take a moment and share something that we see as a downside of traditional grading systems as they are, or maybe just why you want to be here if you think grading systems and grading in general is perfect. What are you hoping to get out of today? So I'll give you a moment for that while we're getting started. All right, while you're typing in, I'm assuming everyone is a good student. I see a lot of good students that I know in the chat. Oh, yes. Love this. Stymies a growth mindset. An early slip can tank a student for the semester. Yeah, and so there's been a lot of research and a lot of work done in this space in terms of grading. I don't want to rehash all of it, but I did like this quote from this Josh Eiler article that was, from the very beginning, grading was more about sorting, signaling, and certification than it was a system for supporting or enhancing students in their learning. So when you look into the history of grading, there's a lot of work there to show how it is more a process of producing workers than it was really about education, and that what we're hoping to do. Yes, thank you, Mark. So here are a couple of my grading truths that I think hopefully we'll all share as we sort of move forward, but I thought I should share them with you. One is traditional grading is a disservice to students. At the very best, it's just not great. I mean, the fact that I could have a student in my class earn a different grade than a student in another class, or I don't know, even retaking my class, we know that there's a lot of research to show that the most important indicator, the most statistically significant indicator in how a student does in a course is the instructor. It's nothing at the student level, not their preparation, nothing that they're doing. It's who they have as an instructor. And whether that comes down to maybe an instructor who's not being rigorous, or an instructor not being supportive, or the grading system in that class, that is a problem in and of itself. And then the other truth that we need to have is that there's no one right way to disrupt the traditional grading system. You'll sometimes see people who are like, oh, this is the way. I am not that type of person. I'm going to present you with a bunch of different options. And then it's all about tinkering with and playing with these different ideas until you get something that feels less icky to you. So here's my roadmap for the day. We'll talk a little bit more about the problems with grades. We'll, of course, go through solutions and then some smaller first steps, because a lot of those possible solutions are just blowing up the entire traditional grading system. And that is a big ask because that really requires you to have the entire semester ahead of you and the ability to just sort of throw out all the stuff you might have already created and done. So there are some ways to kind of take the pieces of those grading ideas and alternative grading and do it in a smaller sense. So we'll talk about those. So let's talk about the problems with grades. I've just recently listened to a Josh Eiler podcast on teaching higher ed. So he's been on there 3 times, always very quotable. And there were so many quotes I could have chosen from, but I think this one kind of gets back to the first share in the chat of that it stymies a growth mindset, grades in general, traditional grading systems. And this is the idea that students in a traditional grading system are so scared of making mistakes that they produce more behaviors of trying to get the grade than of actually learning, right? They're not hoping to learn anything. They're just, how do I get the points so that I can get my A in the class? And that's not what we're hoping for in our classrooms as instructors. Another great quote from this particular same podcast was that they're not an objective and accurate measurement of learning. I think we even know that, hopefully. I know that there's been times, happens every semester, where I give a student a grade, or the grade that Canvas says at the end of the semester doesn't feel right for a particular student. Maybe it's higher than I feel like their understanding was, or maybe it's lower. But there's always been that situation where you're like, there's something wrong. I need to tinker some more. And the folks who don't feel that way, of course, are the ones who are like, oh, an 89.5, that's a B, because they feel like there's some large difference between an 89.5 and a 90.1, right, in this sort of omnibus grade situation. So grades themselves, they have a bunch of unintended consequences. I think these are even more clear in our co-requisite and supported classes. One is it pits students and teachers against each other. We start haggling over grades and points. I'm giving points and thinking more about how to justify the points that I'm giving than I am trying to help the student learn the material. The students are sitting there trying to figure out how they can get more points as opposed to how they can learn the material. In general, it's not working towards what we know is important in culture responsive teaching, which is having that partnership between the instructor and the student. They measure output. They don't really give any value to the process of learning itself, which really, in terms of these students that we need to teach how to become good math students, right, is not doing that part of it. And as was put in the chat earlier, right, an early slip can really tank their entire course grade. It's very much weighted towards failure. In terms of the 0 to 100, 50% of that scale is in that failing range. And then in general, we're really measuring in a lot of the ways that I've seen in fellow instructor syllabi, compliance or the timing of understanding rather than whether or not a student actually understands the mathematics. All right, so this all comes down to this lovely Butler Nissen quote that researchers found that once we put a score on an assignment, a student is less likely to review comments or learn from that grade. So how do we fix all of this? What are some potential solutions? Well, there are a lot of alternative grading ideas out there. Most people are doing some versions of multiples of these, but we'll sort of just look at a couple. They all have some shared philosophies. All 4 of the systems that we're going to talk about, they all believe that grades should reflect understanding and not compliance, that they should reflect a student's current understanding, not their understanding necessarily at the beginning of the course or in week 3, that students should have multiple opportunities and methods to demonstrate their understanding, and that our time as faculty is just better spent giving feedback than assigning points. I'd much rather be helping students understand and learn mathematics than quantify how much they understand. So the first of these 4 is contract grading. This was made really big in English. It's about the idea that grades should reflect students' labor. you'll typically see this aligned with a grading contract. So in order to earn an A, you have to turn in a certain amount of work. I think for a lot of us in math, this immediately seems problematic. We don't necessarily want to reward labor. We want to reward understanding. But there's still a lot of this in how a lot, or you'll see this conflated a little bit with the contracts that folks make within the other grading systems. So this particular example is from a Euclidean geometry class by David Clark, where it's sort of saying, here's what you need to do to get an A. But you'll notice the big difference between this and a lot of the folks you'll see in the English sector is that in order to earn that A, they have to have a certain level of work. So they have 12 satisfactory homeworks and 6 exemplary homeworks. Whereas in most of the English things, it's mostly about labor. But even in this is one of my English faculty members that I've presented with, who I adore, you'll see successfully complete. So there's still this idea of getting to a certain level, even within this particular contract grading scheme. The one that if you've been to these previous webinars, seen is standards-based grading. Standards-based grading is really big in mathematics, especially in the high schools, but now beyond. And this is that our grades should reflect a student's proficiency in clearly defined learning objectives. So I grabbed this screenshot from Roger Yang's Calc 1 class from the last webinar in this series. You can see here are the 7 different standards that Roger has in their class: polynomials and power functions, trig functions, product rule, quotient rule, chain rule, combination of rules, and implicit differentiation. Along with nice student-centered language and how many times the student, I assume, gets to pass or has to pass this particular objective. So that's standards. There's also specifications that grades should reflect a student's completion of work to clearly specified levels. There's a lot of gray area between those two. Robert Talbert, author of Grading for Growth, both the blog and the book, has proclaimed himself a specifications grading person, and basically grades his work very similar to that grading contract we saw earlier, where now everything is at just 2 levels, either success or retry, but doesn't meet the expectations of the assignment, yes or no. And then last, we have the work with Susan Bloom, ungrading, and this is that grades should be minimized or non-existent, really focusing instead on feedback, and then determine collaboratively with the instructor if they have to exist. And this one's hard. I have not seen anyone doing this in the math realm that I could grab something from quickly. I know Wendy Rummerfield is doing this in a stats course, where she did a presentation at US COTS, I believe, where she had kept scores without students knowing, in a separate system, and also had done ungrading along the side, and found that her students' assessment of their scores was actually on par with what she thought they would have gotten based on the previous grade system that she had. But again, kind of feels dependent on who your students are, and a lot of work potentially. So I am going to give us a little bit of time, since I don't love talking. I do, I talk. I'm going to throw a link in the chat. I have made some shared notes, so go ahead and click on that link in the chat. But I've gone and put in those alt grading strategies, along with some bullet points in terms of what they are in a little more detail, because I just went very broad strokes over it, along with some really quick ideas of how you could do this without going completely into contract grading or completely into standards-based grading. And then I also gave an area for each of those. If you expand the little outline, you can actually click to anyone. A little collaboration space where you can basically put a challenge or a concern you have with that particular grading system, And I'm just going to give us like 10 minutes. I'll even start the timer up here at the top. I'm going to make everyone dizzy by scrolling. Where you can just go through and look and add some notes if you have, but I'm going to give us time to just sort of explore that, and then we'll talk about those smaller steps that we could use. So I will stop sharing for a moment, I guess. I'll put this back actually. And I will, yeah. This can make for a riveting recording, Myra. I'm sorry. Yeah, and if you want to explore in the other areas and write down challenges of traditional grading, you definitely can. Like I said, there's a lot that I just added to this that we had a space to sort of collaborate. I like being able to take something away at the end of a webinar. I love that I feel like we've all ended up in standards-based grading. So if you're, yeah, feel free to add on either side so we can have multiple solutions to these concerns or problems. I love it. That is a reasonable challenge. All right, we've got a minute left and it looks like we've started slowing down. I think we're probably reading each other's ideas. There was a whole lot here. But we can go back to the main thing. I don't want this to go off. Thank you. All right, so thank you, thank you, thank you. Like I said, all of these are methods that you'll see around. I can't remember, John, who said that it was a webinar I went to, and I can't remember what school, but they had done some beautiful statistics. And because they wanted to look in to see what was helping their students be successful in math, and they found the number one predictor was, I'm sure I can find it in my email because I emailed them about their stats because I think they ended up doing some like fun random forest stuff, which is like what my dissertation research was in. So I was like, yes. All right, so let's talk about some smaller first steps, some concrete tips and strategies specifically for the calculus classroom. So what are some small things that we could do now? Because throwing out everything and saying, let's do ungrading, or, rethinking everything and figuring out what those standards are going to be can be really, really overwhelming when we first start this. So the first one, and all these, by the way, are also still in that document if you want more. Like I said, I think it's really important that we are grading understanding, especially in calculus, because I want at the end of the day my students to be successful in Calc 2. So in my course, grades are based on exams, portfolios, quizzes, and take-home quizzes. And so of that, 70% of that grade is what I consider controlled assessments. So the exams and the quizzes, those are taken in class, independently, individually, so that there's no collaboration and they have what resources I have deemed appropriate for those quizzes and or exams. Whereas the portfolios and the take-home quizzes, they can work together, they can get help, they can use outside resources like ChatGPT, whatever they need. But I do still hold them to high standards and hope that they can do all those things independently. So like I said, a big chunk though is can you individually do this stuff? So first, I'm grading understanding. I'm not grading when it happened. So everything in the course from the exams to the take-home quizzes can be reassessed to show growth. For things like the portfolio and the take-home quizzes, that's as simple as me providing feedback and letting students revise that work. But this is nice because I can really ensure that it is the students' work and it is low stakes in that the students are not just necessarily copying something, because I tell them, just give me your first draft thinking and I will help you make sure that it gets up to where we need to be. Um, and everything, especially those portfolios and take home quizzes, I have suggested deadlines for when they should do those based on what will help them prepare for the quizzes. But if they need more time to complete them, they can do so at a later date. I do eventually close them, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So first things first, I think we ended up having a lot of conversation around the standards-based grading. There's a lot of buzz in that space anyways. So standards-based grading in general makes me think of backwards design, right? We need to identify what the standards are, then we figure out how could we assess those standards, and then we can design our course so that we're making sure that students are able to meet the mark in terms of what we're hoping for. So when I think of deciding both, number one, what is that outcome? And two, how am I going to assess it? One of my favorite frameworks to sort of look at outcomes. Obviously, we have outcomes in our course outlines. We have lists of topics in our course outlines. I like to look at those using this ESIL lens that Maria Anderson has shared before at AMATIC and on her blog. And so this is what she says, basically like go through your topics and decide, is it something that we just need them to know the existence of? Like they need to know that if somebody mentions it later on, they can go Google partial fraction decomposition and then they have the resources there. And this is something we don't even have to assess. This could just be, we're going to spend time on it. We're going to do some classwork. But I don't need to know you can do it at all. I just want to know that you know exists. That's all. Then there's supported. Can they do it with support? So for me, these are the things that end up on my take-home quiz and my portfolio, because as long as they can do it with all the additional supports that they might have outside of class, I'm pretty happy. Then there's independent. These are the things that to me are actually standards, right? I need to know a student can do this on their own, that they can do this and keep it in their brain, and then they might need to refresh it, but they'll be able to do it again in the future. And so these are the things that end up on or the topics and skills that end up on my quizzes and unit exams. And then last are these lifetime skills. Can they do it and maintain it? Like, I don't want to have to say, okay, I'm going to quiz you again on implicit differentiation. Without even letting them know, could I just give them that and then be able to do it? So I tried to come up with things that fell into these levels for me in my Calc 1 course, and these may not align with yours. So for me, epsilon delta proofs and the precise definition of a limit, those fall into existence. I'm glad to know, I'd be happy if they know it existed, but at the end of the day, they'll be fine if they don't see a proof in week 3 of Calc 1 and then not see a proof again until like discrete and or linear. For supported, the infinite limits, especially one-sided infinite limits, right, where we're talking about like, ooh, are we headed towards positive or negative infinity? Analytically, not graphically, that is something that is like such a little niche topic that I think of that as something that I do put it on a take-home quiz, but it's never, ever, ever going to make it onto a real in-person quiz, right? I will spend that in-person quiz making sure students have some of the other algebra skills down from analytical limits that might be useful when they get to Calc 2, or, playing with something else. But this is not something I would ever need to put on a quiz. But I'm happy to see them make the connection maybe between that and numeric limits or our tables that we look at in some way. And then independent, implicit is probably one of those topics that falls into independent versus lifetime, like all of our differentiation techniques. And I think you see this actually in Roger's SBG setup. If you go look at the resources that were provided for that last webinar, if you look at how many times something is assessed, it feels very on brand with this framework, right? These things that he's assessing on the test, the midterm, and the final exam, that feels like a lifetime skill, right? That feels like it fits that L. And I agree with almost every one of these, right? I want my students to walk away from my class being able to do all of those differentiation techniques just like off the back of the hand, right? I want them to be able to do those. Versus you can see everything in the limits section, single exam, continuity gets a quiz and an exam. So those are maybe more on that independent level of understanding. All right. So, and this is thinking the same way. One thing I will say, talk about that. Oh, thank you, Myra, for throwing that one study in there. What was I going to say? I got so easily distracted. I don't remember. In terms of cheating on a take-home quiz or test, I assume that they will cheat. I do everything in my power to make sure students know that the purpose of that is for them to learn, and then I just let them use resources as they see appropriate. I do make it really clear what is and isn't appropriate use of certain resources for a take-home quiz or test. So like I give take-home quizzes that are mostly meant to prepare them for our in-class quizzes. And those in-class quizzes are mostly meant to prepare them for an exam or just something that's on that eye level of understanding. Like all of these things in the limits land, for me, would be very similar to Rogers. Theirs are going to be only on a quiz and that's it. So for me, if a student cheats on that take-home quiz, they're probably not going to do well on the in-class quiz. And sometimes they just don't realize that following that solver website, whatever it was, is not doing them any good in terms of learning. So usually they figure that out pretty quickly. So it's not an issue that I've seen, but also my take-home quizzes are worth very, very little, right? That's only 30% of my overall grade between that and the portfolios, those things that they could get outside help on. Oh, so the other piece, I remember now what I was going to say. I do think that all of this is really, I mean, probably preaching to the choir because there's not a ton of people here. You all showed up on a Friday for a grading webinar. But I will say, I have seen some final exams for colleagues where I don't think they've taken the time to really think about what's the most important skills moving on. What do I want my students to know and take with them as they continue on in this course? So I've seen a final exam for Calc 1 that was like related rates, 2 derivatives of inverse functions, like just some like kind of strange and esoteric pieces, and very little of this like basic computing derivatives that we know that they're going to need to have down when they head into Calc 2. So I'm saying this because I do think there are folks who haven't thought through this, like, what are the different levels of each of the topics in my course? They're not all created equal. They don't all need the same number of assessments. They don't all need the same type of assessment. We need to really think about that before we move forward in our courses. And I think this is a really great exercise. This is something I did with a group at my college where we took a particular unit in our class, the calculus series, and we just applied this framework to it. Each of us independently just went through the topics that were listed in our course outline, and then we just talked about it. And so, right, I'm calling epsilon delta existence, and my colleague said it was an independent level skill, and we just had a conversation about it. So just knowing what others think is important is really useful because our students might move between classes or become tutors and help others. And sometimes we put things as really important because we think they're amazing. Like I think related rates are really, really cool. I just don't know that they are important enough to end up on my final, knowing that my students aren't going to see them again. But there's always room for different options. I have not taught a fully online calculus class. Our school does not support the idea of fully online calculus courses. And I don't know that I would want to in terms of like the workload of trying to like make sure that students were authentically doing those assignments. So the second easy first step, right? So easy first step, thinking about your different assessments, but thinking about those objectives and how I might test them is something we can all do, right? And be like, maybe rethink whether something needs to be on an exam at all. But the second one is reassessments. And so this 4 pillars and feedback loops we trust, this graphic we basically talked about the first column, right? This clearly defined standards. The next 3 columns to me are all made possible through reassessments, because helpful feedback is only helpful if it's actionable, right? And if I can't reassess on whatever I just did as a student, that feedback has no meaning. In order for our grades to indicate progress, we need the ability to reassess, and then reattempts that penalty also feels like exactly the same idea, reassessment. So how do we do these? Well, this quote from my syllabus, and why are they so important? I think reassessments are super important because we need students to have a space where they feel like they can make mistakes, where they can try something and not know if it's right, and there's no penalty, right? And that happens during class, yes, but it should happen even in assessments, right? The number of times students leave problems blank or used to leave problems blank, like that was maddening to me. Like, write something down, do something. You're capable of something here. I know you are. Um, and so I've changed my class where it's really influenced by the Grading for Equity book by Joe Feldman. And this one quote, this idea that assessments are formative until they're summative, right? Like every piece of information, if I give you a grade, if I give you feedback, it's to help you learn and improve your understanding. And then once you can show me you understand, we're good. So like I said, everything in my class, students can reassess, and I want them to use that feedback and their performance to figure out how they can actually learn. We lost all of those classes where we used to teach students study skills and how to be a good college student, how to be a good math student. And I personally don't love the idea of having a separate like Canvas module on soft skills or having my students do a worksheet. Instead, I want them to actually see and practice what the strategies have as an outcome. Like what strategies are actually going to help you become a stronger learner, like stronger at something. Did this strategy work? Was you working on this online homework platform? Was that helpful? Did you do better? Maybe we need to reassess and come up with a different strategy for next time. So that's my hope, is that students are taking with each of these reassessments some knowledge of like, okay, that one didn't work. That was not the right way for me to figure this out. I need to think of a new way to study this material. So what this looks like in terms of like my quizzes, this is an example for one of my quizzes along with some student work, and in the corner, which you can't see, is a little video of me because this was from my solutions, where I asked the student for permission to share their solution. But when we were learning about continuity, will it be more stick? When we're learning about continuity, I just had this first question: determine the value of b to make f of x continuous at x is equal to 2. Explain your reasoning. So this question is from the TBIL Check It question bank, which I have linked in the notes. But this is one of those situations where in my class, I feel like there's standards, like the things I want them to be able to do. But at each standard, there are specifications they have to meet. So the specifications to me are, is the calculus good? Is the communication and notation correct? And then also, is all the algebra and supporting stuff good too? So in this case, this student in this particular example had beautiful notation. We have a limit with an actual argument. Thank you so much. They've made it clear where both of those one-sided limits, what those are actually equating to. They've written up a sentence even talking about the function value, so they clearly understand the idea of continuity. The calculus is there. And then their algebra on the right-hand side is perfect. So this student got 2 out of 2. They got perfect score for continuity, showing me that they understood what that meant. Now, there was only 2 students in my class of 40 that got a perfect score on the first try. Everyone else had a notation error, maybe left off the actual function's value in terms of their definition, right? A lot of students would just be like, yeah, the left and right side limits were both -2. So continuous. Some of them had algebra errors over here, especially with that fraction. They all got a 1 out of 2, which meant you got to redo it. And so that reassessment, though, I'm not going to give them the same question. Instead, now the question, again from the TBIL question bank, was classify the type of discontinuity, explain your reasoning with limits. So a student who was hoping that they could just mimic by looking through the answer key of the previous question now actually was like, oh no, they expected me to understand all the stuff about continuity that was covered in class. So these are some of my takeaways for reassessments in order to make them a little less painful. I don't find them painful at all. So that second one, the third bullet point here is sort of what I just showed in the second one. I try to make sure they're at least significantly different than the previous assessment, but often I will make them more challenging. So I might, on the second assessment, change it to that question. On the third assessment, they may have to do both because I really want to motivate students to try to figure out how to learn the material in the timeline that we are currently in. I don't want to penalize them if they can't, but I want students to have that motivation that they're going to have to figure this out, and the earlier they do, the better in terms of the challenge. I do limit when reassessments can happen. You can also see this in that work that Roger shared. All of those things had like a date where it was like, you have to do this by this particular date. My students have the same set up in my class. They have to do all of those reassessments on their quizzes and their take-home quizzes before the summative assessment for that particular material. The reason for that is, one, I don't want to be grading things for the rest of the semester, but two, I really want students to have an accurate idea of whether or not they're going to be able to be successful. Most of them can, but every once in a while you get a student who's like, it's fine, I'm going to do everything at the end, and you know that's not going to be possible. So when you have these sort of close dates throughout the semester, it really lets students know where they are in the course instead of letting them have this sort of false hope. And then the last one, I really like having students demonstrate that they've done something before attempting a reassessment. I think my favorite way of doing that is just having a Google form that they had to use to sign up for the reassessment. And on that Google form, I gave them options like, oh, I did some work in our online homework system. Oh, I found some similar questions. Oh, I worked with a tutor. And the form worked in two ways. One, I got to see what they did. They could lie, obviously, but two, it gave them options because not every student really understands how they could go and learn this material. So giving them a series of options, including another, really allows me to like, hey, here are things you could be doing. And then if a student is not actually progressing, that gives me the opportunity to sort of look at that data and be like, wait a minute, well, maybe we need to reassess. But they usually will do that on their own. Oh, the next idea is different grading scales. This is a lot. I'm gonna admit this right now. This is Robert Talbert's original like EMRN scale that he used for his specifications grading, where he had these four different possibilities for student work, right? It was either excellent or exemplary, it met expectations, it needed revision, or it was not accessible. He has since actually moved and is now using grading scales, which is more in line with the specifications grading that Linda Nilsson had. This is what I used to do, where he's basically marking things as either success, you have demonstrated it, it's well communicated. So this is what an E is, right? This is what I was holding students to on that continuity quiz. And then if it doesn't get an E, it's a retry. And it even makes a note here that like basically that means the M and the R are together in that retry. But like his note is like the N, the students who have something systematically flawed or just a fragment of thinking, they are getting no feedback. So for me, that was sort of the students who ended up getting this not yet designation in my grading system, where it was like, there's not enough here for me to, the calculus isn't here at all. So we need to work on that. And that was sort of an indication for me that that was a student I really needed to reach out and have some conversations with. That's what he was using. Since I was using a very similar scale, I've since moved to a scale that's more similar to the EMRN. It actually is more in line with like how the AP Stats exam is graded, where I was giving students like a complete was the exemplary, Substantial was it meets expectations, but it could be better, right? Like it's there's either an algebraic or a communication issue. Two is developing. That means I can see that they understood something about the calculus concept, but there was some fatal flaws. And then minimal is like there's nothing there that involves calculus. The calculus is really really uh, sus. And so I moved this way. I will say I like having more of a gradient for myself in terms of understanding like who I need to reach out to. Because before the ones involved students who just like left off an f of x when they were writing a limit at one point, as well as students who had some really much bigger errors. So I have a better understanding of who I need to like communicate with. But what I'm finding is that a lot of my students who get substantial are kind of just stopping there. They're not taking the reassessment and trying to get to a full points. And I'm like, before they kind of had to because they were at a 1. Because as was mentioned in the chat, it is a grading scale that has points. Like I am not actually not using points. I don't have a contract based grade like Robert Talbert does with his, where you have to get 16 of the standards at a success or something. These are actually going into my grade book as points. I just have them coded in my grade book so that they show up more obviously with these other labels, but there's still points below the surface. So it's a nice, I think, stepping stone for somebody who's not willing to be like, okay, I'm going to keep track of all of this in spreadsheets, right? That was one of the concerns we had in the Google Doc, where I have to constantly like, right? I mean, Roger showed this beautiful GIF of like grades changing over time. And I was like, yeah, if I had to keep a separate grade book for every student and what their current set, like that's a lot, especially because you have to do that outside of Canvas usually, because Canvas does not, and all learning management systems do not play nicely with these non-traditional grading systems. So I am using a sort of non-traditional grading system just within Canvas. And so, yeah, they do recognize that it's a point system with words, but it's a point system with words that, as it was before, really force them to reassess and show me that their understanding was perfect, which even worked in the supported class was able to work really well. And yeah, so I use this all within the grading scheme in Canvas. Yeah. Yeah, Canvas, they do have a system, but it's just not as easy. So as you see, like when you look at this too, I have a weighted grade. I use it mostly as like an omnibus because I don't want to think about everything that I'm going to do throughout the semester ahead of time. I like to be a little more fluid. So I do still have traditional grades. I still have traditional grade categories. I'm just moving little bits and pieces more towards the alt grading world without going 100% in there, which in some ways is helpful for a lot of students who understand a traditional grading system. And I also realize it's not perfect and these grades are all a little bit, subjective in the first place. So in-person exams, I really like, yes. And so Myra's question in the chat, I do replace. So once a student reassesses in their higher score, I just replace. I will have students who reassess and get a lower score, which is definitely possible because I tend to make my reassessments a little more challenging. I do not enter the lower score. So there's no penalty for reassessing and doing worse. It's just the best that they can prove that they can do on that particular thing. I don't think there's any issues with students moving from this like standards E version to something that is truly standards based. There are only a handful of courses in my institution that I know our faculty members are doing standards based. Physics is one, but the folks who went all in physics are actually kind of coming back a little bit because they did standards very differently than Roger did, where he had that standard for like multiple differentiation techniques or whatever at the same time. And so they just had every skill really, really separate. And in physics, when they had to decide which formula to use and what's appropriate, they were really missing that part that I like from my traditional exams, which is identifying which rule to use, right? And so I think like with Roger's example too, everything's on an exam. So there might be a mix of both, right? He's able to assess, are they doing the chain rule when they're supposed to do the chain rule? And then how do they do on the chain rule question? Because they're all mixed up, I assume. Versus like in physics, they were all quizzes. And so a student would be like, oh, this is the quiz on blah, and they'd know exactly what the quiz was on, and we're able to kind of mimic their way through it. So they've actually moved backwards. And yes, exactly what Myra said. You could have picking the right method be a standard and have a separate quiz on that if you wanted. I just truly haven't gotten there. And I'm have the opposite concern of Jody, which is I am not as worried about the possibility that students might struggle in a standards-based system. I'm more worried that they're going to struggle when they move on to our very, very traditional Calc 2s in my department. So I still have a traditional exam because I want them to see what that might look like and be prepared. I know it's not necessarily a great reason to do something that they might see it in the future, but I also really love how I wrote my exams back in the day. And so again, it's just a small step where all I have done in the real standards-based world is my quizzes, and there's a 30%. Everything else is fairly traditional in terms of my class. Those exams, everything else is graded in a points-based, not the best system, but there's still the opportunity for growth because my students can still retake an exam that they do poorly on if they want to during the final exam. And in general, I think those exams have been going really well in terms of I've done everything in my power. My class is like preparing them for everything that could come at them. So our class, they're doing a ton of the problems in every type of mixed up situation that they might see on an exam in class. We're doing that in our assessments. They have that take-home quiz, and they have the in-class quiz, and then they get the exam. So I'm trying to like take off scaffolds and support as we go. And then I'm giving them like every old exam I've ever done. And they have all of those. We take one in person in class, like an actual mock exam, and then discuss it. And then I post like 3 or 4 other old exams on Canvas that they can go take and look through and see sort of the difficulty level and types of questions they might arise. But of course, I'm going to change things so it's not them seeing the same questions at all. In general, to answer the question about how they're doing in the following calc courses, I did have a number of my class students who did really well in my very first semester teaching this take Calc 2 the next semester. A couple did well, and a handful who I like had no doubt in my mind. To me, an A grade means you're going to make it in Calc 2. Did not make it through Calc 2. They went from a very active learning course with extra time and all of the scaffolding to a course that was completely lecture based. They had take home quizzes still, and then a test, and they got wrecked. I don't think they understood, like they needed that in-class quiz to really understand that like just because you worked on a take-home quiz with your friends does not mean you know the material for the exam. And just because you were able to do it on a take-home quiz and it was just this one little topic doesn't mean that you can figure out which of the 10 topics that are on the exam are being dealt with. So that's in my like, I think I still have the side of like lessons learned. I think I needed to be more like intentional with my students in terms of telling them all the things I was doing that were making them successful. Yeah, Jody.
Because I'm noticing that a lot of the students are, for some reason, and I don't know if it's because of this or if it's because of the instructor and the way they're doing it, or it's the grading. I'm not really sure what's going on, but I'm having other instructors from other departments tell me that these students just are not getting it, or they're just not adjusting well, like you were saying, when going from this type to a standards lecture at all.
Yeah, so I think that so part of like I ended up teaching Calc 2 in the summer. And I had a lot of my own students from my spring class and a lot of those students who had failed Calc 2 in spring. And I did not pull any punches. I used the tests from that other Calc 2 class as sort of my like, I'm going to do very similar questions and level of questions. And I know I'm going to grade just as hard as that instructor. But I added a little, like a lot more support in those in-person quizzes. And my students all did really well. And now they're all in Calc 3, and that instructor who they failed Calc 2 with has actually come to me and been like, they're all doing really well. And I'm like, yes. I think they needed that like one step off of the Calc 2 with like a little bit less support and not the giant cliff that they went off of from my class to someone else's. I don't think they handled that well.
So do you think that they should, is it weaning off in the semester that you're teaching it, or weaning it off during each semester that they're taking calculus?
I think ideally it'd be each semester that they're taking calculus. We even had like a kind of unofficial thing that happened at our campus before, where like I had a colleague who was like very mothering. She like would have extra office hours. Like she was just like the most nurturing human in the world. She would teach our trig class. My colleague who's like a little bit in between her and I would teach pre-calc, and then they'd come to me. And it was kind of like the perfect amount of like stepping off each semester. So I think ideally that's it. I don't think that they could handle it necessarily throughout the semester, because when we get to integration, they still need just as much support. All right.
Kelly,
Yes,
it
Maya.
seems too that we maybe could, if we can't change what our colleagues are doing in the subsequent courses, to really think about what supplemental instruction, peer mentoring, that kind of outside support, which could build not only STEM identity, but the habits of mind that you need to survive STEM. So
I
I
love
think
that.
it shouldn't just be, I feel hopeless when I think about, oh my God, we're going to actually have to have all of our math faculty be cognizant of equitable grading practices or doing things that are more supportive and hopeful of students. But if we could think intentionally about students leaving because Calc 1 should be an on-ramp, right? That's not the end of the STEM degree, it's the beginning. So it should really be thought of after the on-ramp, what happens next? And is there a way to build that in wraparound supports that are even, peer-based, which I think they might have more weight, right? If your peers who finish Calc 2 are telling you, these are the study strategies, this is when the study groups meet, right, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think that was actually what got my Calc 2 course through, is it wasn't the things we were doing in class. They all went to our STEM center after and spent hours in the STEM center every day working together and doing some of those things. I had the worksheets and the things to give them. And even before I gave them some, but not enough. And so now at least I have all those pieces that I can provide, and that instruction of like, hey, here's the STEM center. I don't think I was intentional enough at the end of Calc 1, kind of warning them about what was happening and all the things I had done to like intentionally help them and what they needed to do to be successful. I could have done better. But I think a lot of that is showing them how to do it on their own. And so that way they could have. I also think that a stepping stone where there's a little bit of support in the Calc 2 would be nice. So we're out of time, but I will mention, I do think another a way to just slightly dip your toe into grading for growth. As said, use that framework to decide what can be a quiz as opposed to putting on an exam. It'll really help streamline your exams and give students more time to sort of show what they know on the things that are really important. Separating skills on those exams. I do think that I see a lot of faculty that like to interweave skills, and that's lovely, but it can get overwhelming for students when they're doing a lot of things at once. So for an example of that, this is Calc 2. I think Calc 1 is a little simpler, so I haven't felt the need to do this as much. But in Calc 2, there are some really challenging topics and integration techniques, and even in series. So having students sort of break those apart, maybe it's, as Myra pointed out, the idea of like, can you tell me which technique to use? Okay, now that you've done that, go do it. But having students take that step sometimes can just sort of assuage some fears. The things that are maybe not as important on that ESIL, maybe that are in the I or the S, consider maybe having a nice little wrap up of something that you don't mind if they get extra help on, like a portfolio or a project. So I do a portfolio for my limits. They've done quizzes to show me that they can do all these things independently, but then I want them to kind of put it all together in something that's culminating. So it feels like we've closed that chapter of the book. So I do a portfolio where they have a number of options. I did want to mention this like idea of the 4 aspects of equitable grading from Feldman, and how a lot of this is happening in this class. the way it is structured, weighting recent performance with reassessments, reframing homework. I don't grade homework. I grade those take-home quizzes, but they're just a handful of questions for them to get some practice with their peers. Grading only based on summative, so there's no participation. My students are all in class every day participating, but there's no participation grade. Renaming grades whenever possible, just sort of changing that dynamic. And then moving towards rubrics and standards-based grading if you can. So for me, that rubric is kind of like communication, notation, algebra, and calculus. Like those 4 things, like there's like a 2-point rubric where it's like you either have them or you don't. That's happening for each problem. And then I just wanted to end with a final quote that was from my student Augustine, who's actually posted in this picture. This is one of my students that took that Calc 2 class, did not do so well, and came back. And one part of his little message to me was the opportunities to redeem ourselves are invaluable. Sometimes it's hard to move forward after a setback, but having those chances instilled a sense of optimism and hope. So like I said, you don't have to go all the way into standards-based grading to still have students have this sort of feeling at the end of the course, only because they could just reassess on quizzes, right? Like that ability just sort of made a huge difference for this particular student, knowing that he wasn't going to get behind and not be able to be successful. So last, obviously there's ungrading, there's specifications grading, there's all the books that were up previously, but these are like kind of the big 3 for me at the moment. David Clark and Robert Talbert are both math professors and amazing. They just published that Grading for Growth book. Feldman's book is really nice if you want just like ideas of ways that you could disrupt the grading that aren't so whole, everything. And then Josh Eiler, always very, poignant in terms of what he's saying. So I also have resources at the end of these slides where you can go ahead. There's an overview that started with one that David Clark made. There's a link to the Slack channel where all of these great minds post up stuff, and it's full of math folks. There's their blog. There's a conference they do. Teaching in Higher Ed has podcast episodes with like all of these lovely humans, and they're all amazing. And then, of course, a couple of my own things, but that is it. And yeah, thank you. Sorry for going 4 minutes over.
Thank you so much, Kelly. So again, you can find Kelly's presentation and slides on the CAP website, probably by the end of day Monday, under accelerationproject.org, the events tab. Thanks again, Kelly. Learned so much as always from you, and I appreciate your generosity in doing this today.
Thanks
Thanks for joining, everyone. Have a good weekend.